Hey everybody, this is Tim from Tim and Fran vs. the Man. I'm Tim.
And I'm Fran.
So today we're doing an election special. Well, I guess there technically is something special about this election because this is probably the most heated election I've seen in my lifetime. Because most of the time it's between two essentially like very boring neoliberal corporate controlled candidates, whereas this time it's between a very boring neoliberal candidate and then a person who, might possibly be free of those corporate strings. I mean, probably not really, but at least the perception is there. So one side believes that he's a fascist, and the other side believes that he is a god emperor.
Right. And, the beliefs that he's a fascist are not organic either. You've had 4 to 5 years of intense social engineering from social media, and so that's helped fuel the contention. And so we have half the country, as you said, believing he's some kind of like godlike figure, and then the other half is in the belief that there's an imminent fascist takeover, under Trump, and so we're looking at an explosive election with consequences that will be felt for years to come.
Right, and then also on the other side, there is... What's interesting about this election is also that the left doesn't even actually like Biden. They just see him as like a boring corporate-backed neoliberal, and they see him as like slightly better than fascism. And then a lot of people on the right see him as like a particularly crooked figure, and then some people are... well, the QAnon type people, they're kind of like convinced that he's like a satanic reptilian lizard pedophile. I mean, he's probably a pedophile, but the other stuff maybe not as much. So we'll be getting into that as well.
Yeah. Well, where do we start? Do you want to start with Trump or Biden? Do you want to start maybe going into like who we think may win this thing, or
I think we should talk about who wins at the end. I think that's a good, personally, at least that's what I think. So I guess what I wanted to get into is some of the issues and some of like the biggest kind of contentious issues that are going to go into, forming people's opinion in this election. And I think probably the number one thing is, or one of the number one things is COVID, because we've had to deal with it basically all year, and a lot of people definitely believe that Trump has completely botched the response. You kind of have the entire international corporate media as well, like pushing this idea that America is particularly or Americans in general have been particularly stupid in their reaction to COVID-19. So I think that that's going to definitely be it's definitely going to be a factor in the way that people decide. Mm-hmm. But then I think, as well, on the other side, there's a lot of people who are really tired of the lockdowns. They think that it was draconian. I probably also, I fall in that camp. I think that the lockdowns are, the economic effects far outweighed, or were far worse than I think the actual disease is.
And we're seeing too, initially in like March, we had some of those, rallies like Michigan and areas of the country where like rural America was particularly affected. People they generalized people protesting and said, they were like stupid rednecks. They had no idea, about science and why even these lockdowns were in place. And now we're seeing, the educated members of the EU, literally revolutions going on, in France, Spain, Britain, days and days of rioting, particularly actually in Naples as well. I've been seeing some pretty intense videos from the EU as they start to roll lockdowns back into place through December. And so, COVID-19 is one of the bigger issues. And I think another issue that's really sprung up is, sort of the militarization of the left, with particularly Antifa in the wake of the George Floyd killings. There just seems to be sort of this daily unrest that's going on in the country. Since June, really, businesses being smashed, exchanges of gunfire, particularly out in the western parts of the country, just really an agitated level of violence that, we haven't seen since at least the 1960s. And, people, the average person, is sick of seeing, their communities disrupted. In many cases, especially out west, you have Antifa coming in from other cities. And, they'll go into a city where there was an officer-involved shooting of, an unarmed black person or armed black person even, and they will go and harass the hell out of the locals. They will smash the businesses. They will, generally terrify the local population. I've seen videos as well where, Antifa's shining strobe lights into people's houses and things like that. And so you have, left-wing agitators pushing people who are generally moderate centrists into the Trump camp. And Trump, in the debates, I thought maybe he would sort of falter a little bit because his public speaking isn't exactly the best. But, Trump has been able to completely isolate Biden from his base, with one of the main issues amongst the left these days being climate change. He's completely done circles around Biden in terms of getting Biden to admit that, no, he doesn't support the Green New Deal, or yes, he does support fracking. And so I guess in summary, there's not the same level of energy towards Biden. The left is very reluctant to accept him to begin with. And with these combined factors, I really think that, we could be potentially looking at a Trump victory. And that's not even really getting into Biden's past or, Trump's past.
Yeah, and I think that issue with when during the third debate especially, I think that's the one where Trump really dunked on Biden. I think that that kind of when Trump was basically getting Biden to say, oh, I don't, or oh, I do support fracking, or and kind of baiting him in that way, that it symbolizes the greater schism in the Democratic Party at large, because you have all of these kind of more moderate union members and just people who have slightly more progressive social beliefs, and you have there's just plenty of people who this sort of far left message is completely alienating. But then on the other side you have you have progressive college students who dye their hair, who are dragging around copies of Das Kapital. So the issue is that these two people, it's very difficult to actually bridge a gap between actual Marxists and people who are just very, very moderate milquetoast liberals. And I think that you're kind of seeing a little bit more unity on the right, because whether it be certain libertarians who have kind of accepted Trump despite some of his like more draconian policies, who have accepted some of his like brash behavior even though they don't always care for it. You have like regular conservatives who didn't really like his like rude behavior, but he's actually getting some of their economic policy that they want. And then you even have like people who are on the really far right who are like, oh well, at least he's like cutting down on immigration. So it kind of seems like there's a little bit more for the right wing. It seems that there is a bit. Trump is basically like checking enough boxes to where everyone's getting a little bit of what they want on the right, to an extent at least.
Right, and this is in direct contrast to Joe Biden, and really what's mobilized the left over the last few months again is the perceived racially motivated police killings, and you're not getting the same galvanization of the left or this unity because the candidate that they're having to stomach, passed the crime bill in the 90s, and labeled Black Americans as super predators. Despite him denying saying that, it's the footage is there. You can't deny your own words. Another thing too that's pointing me towards more of a Trump victory is the number of conservatives actually going out to vote. In 2016 there were less conservatives going out to vote. It was mainly the Rust Belt that carried Trump into a victory. However, this time conservatives were sort of on the fence. Seeing the violence in the country, seeing the unrest continue and grow, are going out to vote. They may not like Trump, they may not like his personal life. However, they want to see a restoration of sanity in the United States. They just, don't see that with Biden. And so, yeah.
Yeah, I think, like, one of the only things, I think that there are really only two things that I see that might hypothetically, essentially, like, two issues that might possibly, like, sway people away from Trump at this point, and I think one of them is the fact that he, like, bailed out like large corporations and hasn't really given any more stimulus to middle America. I think that might be one issue where people are probably still a little bit sore at him for. And then I think when he chose to like move the embassy to Jerusalem, and it was he made it he officially recognized it as the capital.
Right.
I think, right. So I think that might alienate some of his like extreme right base, like kind of the strange like ethno-nats and like those types of people. So I think that but the problem is those are kind of the only things I can see that are like really like swaying people away from him. And I guess like the media constantly saying that he like botched the COVID response as well, but
and to speak more about COVID, it was very clear at the very beginning of the outbreak that this is not a disease that any president could handle. No matter how strict their lockdown was, no matter how many masks they forced their citizens to wear, COVID-19 is perfectly adept at spreading in a lockdown situation. So really, regardless of who's in office, you can have the best sort of plans, but as we're seeing in Europe, their outbreaks currently are the worst they've ever been. Hospitals are being overfilled. Hundreds of people or thousands of people are dying a day. So, clearly, the left's vision of, a quote-unquote science-based response is not working. And, if the left really understood the science, they would say, well, this is more infectious than the flu. we can't save everyone, but we can at least perhaps, isolate some of the more vulnerable communities. However, instead they went into a lockdown, which they still defend to the teeth. And so, yeah, very clearly, Trump's response maybe wasn't the best. However, I think it was very realistic in terms of, the transmissibility of what, the virus, that, is currently affecting us. And so, yeah, I think the number of business owners that have lost their businesses, either in, from COVID lockdowns or, riots, you're basically getting the last little bits of the middle class, these small business owners, and you're irritating them. You're literally directly affecting their livelihood and their property. And so, they're going to be motivated to vote, and typically we see, the activism on the left. This time it's really obvious that, the right has this sort of energy that it hasn't had, I don't think in years, at least since the Tea Party movement. I don't know if you've seen videos of people driving around with like massive Trump flags, in different cities across the country, even in California, which is, one of the darkest blue states. There's been a mass mobilization of Trump supporters. And you don't really see that with Biden. Again, they're trying to stomach like a really fake candidate.
Yeah, I mean, I also noticed whenever I drive up to New Hampshire, which is like a swing state, for the most part, I see like almost all Trump signs, and that definitely like speaks to that idea that his supporters have a lot more energy, and really the only thing that is pushing people into like the Biden camp is this idea that Trump is a fascist or a racist or like a buffoon, but the issue is that like a lot of people aren't really listening to that because the other candidate is, well, one, like very boring, two, most likely has dementia, and three, like his corruption, similarly to Hillary Clinton, is just, it's very vast. He has all these like shady connections. He most likely did fire that prosecutor in Ukraine, despite the like massive media gaslighting event. He admitted to firing that person, or blackmailing that person, live on C-SPAN. I mean, technically he didn't admit that it was because his son was being investigated by that prosecutor. Like, he didn't admit to that, but at the same point, that still seems like heavily illegal to me.
Yeah.
Like, regardless of why he did that.
Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, we have the energy of, the right, and we also, again, people on the left call Trump this fascist, but, let's look back at history. Let's see who helped to draft the Patriot Act, one of the more fascistic pieces of legislation to come from the government in quite a long time, and it's Joe Biden. He established the framework for post 9/11 America, which includes a surveillance state, which includes a heavily militarized police force. It includes no-knock raids. All these things that the left has protested against for years and is currently writing against. He was the mastermind, the architect behind pretty much all of it. And someone did the math, and basically he's been in government for about 20% of the United States' history. He's had his chance, and Trump pointing to that during the debates. While he's not my favorite politician, I don't really have a favorite politician at all.
Ron Paul, I guess.
Yeah, I guess Ron Paul's pretty cool. pointing that out, it's resonating with a whole lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, he drafted, or he helped to make the Patriot Act and like the '94 crime bill, which is even more absurd because the left is currently like destroying cities, like furious at like Trump or something. But the issue is that Biden was the one who helped author the '94 crime bill, which is the reason for the, or at least part of the reason for the massive expansion of the police state in the first place. So you have this sort of, I guess like this like very strange cognitive dissonance where people are acting as if, Trump is this horrible racist, but the thing is, it's not necessarily that Trump isn't a racist, it's just the fact that like the media points to like every moment he says something with his like foot in his mouth, something dumb. Like it usually kind of seems like, at least to me, it kind of more so seems that he's just like an old guy from like a different generation, and he doesn't really know how to like speak this new kind of like politically correct like speech. I don't know if he necessarily like means anything by it. I mean, I think sometimes maybe it's possible that he's like getting in like a weird like because he's trying to like appeal to his base in like kind of like a secret way, like the left calls like a dog whistle or whatever. I think that's possible. I think a lot of the time it's really just he has his foot in his mouth a lot.
Right.
And then like what the problem is that you look at Biden and the actual like policy, the actual legislation he has is like extremely fucking racist.
Right.
And has been, and Biden says like a bunch of racist stuff as well, but the mainstream media doesn't really report on it at all.
Or they call his like literal dementia, saying like, I think during one of his speeches he was saying like 250 million people have already died from COVID in the time I talked about, in the time that I've talked or something. And it's like, that's not a stutter, dude. That is like cognitively, you're just not all there. Like, he's always constantly, like, wherever he's walking around, it looks like he's in some kind of daze, like he's on like Quaaludes or something, like, and we're talking about his policies, but, I think we should definitely talk about Kamala Harris, his running mate. With mass incarceration, she's sort of the face of everything that's been wrong with the justice system, sort of the neoliberal justice system model since the 1990s. Not racist on paper, but in terms of what actually happens, it's been more destructive for, these black communities and communities of color than anything a supposed Republican or racist could ever dream of. And so you sort of have like the worst of both worlds with Biden and Harris. You have Harris, who is unabashedly supported the war on drugs that persecuted a whole heck of a lot of people based off of it, and then the sort of classic left wing emphasis on welfare and deciding basically the economic future of an entire race and group of people. Between that, this is more of the same for these communities. And I think a lot more people in these communities are recognizing that than we may initially think.
Yeah, and it's not just like the fact that they are. It's not just the fact that the left is like asleep at this one issue. They're also like completely asleep at the wheel of the fact that like Joe Biden's like track record for like being a warmonger is pretty like, he's basically like voted for, he's never seen like a war he didn't like. And it's very strange to see like these left-wing agitators like going so far up to bat like for Biden. I mean, I know that there are definitely some people on the left who are alienated by Biden. But the thing is that it really seems that if Biden is elected, then we're most likely going to war with Syria and Iran, because he's clearly like controlled by these people, like people who have ties to the military industrial complex. And the thing is that, you know, as much as people were speculating earlier that, oh, well, Trump is probably going to do the same thing, like, and this is like the weird thing, like, I really don't even like Trump that much, but at the same point, like, he's the first politician since, I believe it's Gerald Ford. He's the first politician since Gerald Ford who hasn't started a new war. I would have preferred if he had actually like scaled back the wars, and it's a very low bar, like, oh wow, you didn't start a new war? Oh, thanks, Trump.
Right.
But like at the same point, comparatively, it's impressive, because I guess you have to sort of think about it in the way of that there's this entire like media apparatus, these like gun manufacturers, the military industrial complex, like all of these like characters are attempting to push the administration at all times towards this directive of more invasions. And somehow Trump has been able to like resist that and like not do it. The one thing I am worried about though is that if Trump does get reelected, is it possible that he just completely fucks over his base because he no longer has to worry about the votes? Because the war issue is actually a pretty big one among a lot of like populists and libertarians who supported him.
Well, we have to go back. I think the only, base or way to measure that possibility is just look at the last 4 years. And while there have been a few limited strikes, in Syria, the killing of Soleimani last January, it was nothing like what we've seen even with the Obama administration. We had troops in parts of Africa. We had the complete destabilization of Libya, and now a rampant slave trade there. But with Trump, you really haven't even seen anything. And, at the time, right now, there's a direct conflict between Armenia, and I always forget the name of the other country. It's like Azerbaijan or something. And, there's really been no intervention in that conflict. And I just feel like if we've had any other politician, like Republican or Democrat that's been in power in the last 30 years, like we'd already be at least like sending aid, or, there'd be troops mobilized into that region. And yeah, I think also with getting rid of Bolton, that may also eliminate, Bolton being one of the largest war hawks in the president's cabinet, him being fired, so to speak, really reduces the chance of, us being dragged into a conflict. So yeah. And the continued peace with North Korea as well. We're allowing them to, exercise their sovereignty in such a way that they're not a threat to their, our allies in the region.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that this might be another issue that's going to sort of affect, that may affect the election, is that there are probably a lot of moderates who noticed that we haven't gone to another war, but it's actually possible it might not really have that much of an effect at all, because like I think people are so desensitized to the war now that people aren't even really paying attention to it. They're like, oh yeah, we are still at war. They like don't even really, it doesn't like enter their mind consciously very often. So it might actually just be like people who are like really thinking about the war and really sick of it, and they're like, why are we still there? Like, people like you and I who are like really frustrated with the the cost of human life,
Right.
and like the massive amount of debt that we're going into paying for these like pointless ventures. But it is definitely possible that like the average citizen actually doesn't maybe they actually don't really consider it that much. I think, the big things probably are going to be like the COVID response and the riots and that sort of effect on the average voter, I would think.
Right. It's just really funny because, you've had from big tech to big media, like they've tried every trick in the book to try to undermine, Trump. They've blatantly lied. They've fed the American public, a new scare story. Pretty much every other week they've attempted to impeach him, and so the average person watching all of this, to them, the reason these last 4 years have been so crazy is not because of Donald Trump and anything he's done. In fact, he's kind of done less horrible things than previous administrations. They're not thinking it's abnormal because of him. It's the fact that the media has been continuously sending out these scare stories, sort of trying to increase levels of anxiety. And now, we're seeing that anxiety on the streets. We're seeing the result of years and years of social engineering. And so, there's parts of the population that are realizing, like, Trump's immigration policy is probably honestly not too much different than what happened with Obama. Him being called the deporter in chief. The cages being there long before Trump. Perhaps deporting pretty much everyone and making Mexico's problem wasn't the best idea because they simply don't have the infrastructure. Otherwise, it's not too much different than what these neoliberals have been doing for the last 20 or so years.
Yeah, I mean, that's something I've sort of noticed is that, Trump is really not too much. He's really not like he's like a very like mild reformer comparatively to what everyone's like really freaking out about. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of strange, like the hysteria surrounding him, I think, because I mean, he says things that are dumb. He has like a very like sporadic kind of like confused speaking style. But if you really look at like the policies, most of them are basically very similar to what we've already had, and then there are like a few like improvements, and then maybe like if you're very left on immigration, maybe you don't like him because he's like halved it or something. But he's even done like certain things with prison reform. So I mean, it's just like he's really not all that different from the neoliberals, other than like he does have like a couple of like issues under his belt that does make him like, and I hate to say this, I know it's people are gonna get mad and they're like, oh, you're a racist. There's some like weird stuff like that, but like honestly, if you look at the policy objectively, Trump is like a little bit better than them. Like, just he hasn't gotten us into a war. He reformed the prison system. The economy was doing at least a little bit better before, we locked down the entire economy. Wow, how did the economy crash? What? It's like, imagine. But yeah, it really does seem that like he's really not that like that different or like out there like crazy. He just has a very coarse kind of speaking style. But I feel like there have been presidents like that in the past. I guess the difference is probably they weren't like televised constantly.
Well, someone comes to mind is like Nixon, directly calling groups out, like the hippies, this group, that group, the drug users.
Yeah, that's true.
Trump, it's a little bit more awkward when he's, directly calling out like anarchists or Antifa. You don't typically have a president calling out these specific groups, but this comes back to what we were talking about before, where he's an older man. He's like a grandpa calling out his grandkids for messing around. There's this massive generational gap. And so, a lot of the perceived evil that's come from Trump is not in his actions, but just, things he said in passing, or, phrases that he's uttered. Otherwise, yeah, pretty average president. Not terribly great, but not terrible. Sort of making the best out of the infrastructure that, again, these neoliberals have created, all the while claiming that they're building a better world. And I think this is really shown, looking across the ocean. You see France, the Macron regime. You have people, they've been in a state of emergency for the last 4 or 5 years. Protests are outright banned. The police have been literally rounding up Muslims in mosques and things like that, like storming them. And so, we're not quite seeing anything like that with the Trump administration. And most of the left longingly looks to a place like France, but it's like, if Antifa tried what they're doing in the U.S. and France, they would probably be shot, even especially the Yellow Vest movement. We're seeing an incredibly harsh response against any kind of protests in the EU right now. And, the left, I've heard so many of my leftist friends saying like, oh, I wish I was in Europe. Oh man, if Trump wins again, I'm leaving. And, good luck. So yeah.
Yeah, that's been something I've been annoyed about. I mean, this is a little bit of just kind of tangent or maybe off topic.
Sure.
But when people say oh well, I want to go to Europe or something like that, oh my god, you get certain free things, but well, first of all, they're usually not very good things. They're usually not the highest quality, but it's also just the draconian crap you have to put up with, the types of laws in Europe are just the most it's an insane overprotective mother who's kind of oh well, have you brushed your teeth, and have you gone to bed, did you go to bed by 8, and just all of that. It's I don't know how anyone could live with that, Europe is literally that person, that really irritating, overbearing, maternal figure. It's just so
and
ugh.
I think too, it's the general anger from those types of policies, and then the COVID lockdowns. I think that was, for a lot of people, is the final straw, and so we're seeing, as I mentioned earlier, raw anger spilling onto the streets. Lines of riot police getting stones and bricks and things pelted at them. This is an anger that's been building for a while. And maybe in a future video we could talk about perhaps the future of the EU and where it's going. But this could be sort of the straw that broke the camel's back. And the straw it's more of a steel bar, because these lockdowns have been very draconian and have cost so many people their lives. And you had healthcare professionals at the beginning of the outbreak saying no, we can't do quarantine, we cannot. The toll on the human psyche is just too great for the level of response, again, for a virus that's just pretty much going to spread anyways.
Yeah, and plus the at least the best recordings of the death rate is if you factor in the antibody tests, tends to be around a little, the survival rate is a little over 99% usually.
Right.
And there's some contention about that, but for the most part, it does not seem to be nearly as deadly as initially people had speculated. And I wonder, part of me is interested in, and I actually just thought of this, I'm like thinking, I wonder if some of the rallying behind the Libertarian Party that we've been seeing this election, which is kind of like a new thing. Like last time, the two candidates were really bad. Everyone hated them. So you kind of saw like a decent amount of people like be like, oh well, fuck it, Gary Johnson,
Right.
or Jill Stein, but like a little bit more for Gary Johnson. But this time you kind of see a lot more people really considering Joe Jorgensen, the new Libertarian candidate, and I'm wondering if the kind of draconian lockdowns almost are part of like a catalyst for that. Like sort of, it's kind of like people are finally seeing what the state is capable of and what's sort of like being ushered in against their will, and a lot of people are really tired of it, and so it's like this sort of like backlash of like, oh wait, we might want freedom back, please, like.
Right. And two, with Johnson, because I voted for Johnson myself, but I knew it was a fool's errand. I knew there was going to be no hope. And with Johnson, you had very specific demographics voting for him. With this election, though, I have friends from all walks of life who are, considering voting for Jorgensen, if not outright saying, like, yes, I am going to be voting for her. I have a friend who's, going to be a doctor. I have other friends living in Vermont and areas of northern New England. I think for once, people do see finally how broken the system is. It just really makes me laugh, though, when you talk to someone on the left and it's like they're more willing to like burn down like a Target than they are to like fill out that third option on a ballot, which is really it's hilarious. When it comes to like putting your money where your mouth is, they just can't do it. The role models, I almost feel bad for them, because the role models are people like, I guess, Joe Biden at this point. And I just can't imagine myself like bending knee every 4 years saying, well, he's not the best choice, but the other guy's so much worse. It's just, I don't know, somewhere Karl Marx is just like rolling in his grave. He's like, what happened to my movement?
Where my movement gone?
Where my movement gone?
But yeah, and I think another thing that's like pretty interesting about this like kind of swelling up of the libertarian ticket is that because of how Joe Jorgensen is advertising, and also, and I think this was very strategic, they probably picked a woman on purpose because they knew it played into those fucking identity politics. Because everyone's so obsessed with, oh well, do they have a vagina? That's the big issue of the day. If they have a vagina, that's who you vote for. Right. But if you're not white as well. Right. But so this kind of, you're kind of seeing her like advertise a lot towards the left wing. So she's pushing like a lot of the libertarian social issues, which I find to be like a pretty interesting strategy. I mean, it's pretty smart, but because she's getting like a lot of disaffected, more like liberals and like probably more moderate progressives to like think about voting libertarian. And so I think what's interesting about this election is that Gary Johnson pulled almost all of his votes from Trump, or like I think it was around 75%, were people who would have voted Trump otherwise. I think this election is going to be a lot more split, maybe not, it could be something like, 60-40 or something like that, or maybe even like 55-45.
Right, yeah. And we're going back to sort of, the racial tensions these days. Jorgensen and the libertarian tickets really have like tangible solutions to address this, and especially overly aggressive policing, things like ending the drug war, scaling back qualified immunity, things like this. I haven't heard any of that from Biden. And the person he worked with, President Obama back in the day, he never really did anything either for drug reform. Had started the conversation about legalizing pot, and that's about it. It was very much like sort of a symbolic like gesture, and this brings me this sort of, you can relate to like Justin Trudeau in Canada saying like, yes, we're going to fight climate change, and then authorizing pipelines on native land. Like, people are so sick on both the left and the right of this neoliberal like lies and deceits, while giving like the very bare minimum. And if you're, I don't know, if you settle for this again, like, you're just a fool. In my opinion, you're being played on a very mass scale. Especially by, the modern left, you have like the worst of, war hawkishness and, socialistic thinking. You want to talk about fascism, like, that is fascism. And
Yeah.
we've seen that mainly from the sort of wimpy neoliberal left that the entire world is revolting against. This is not just a United States phenomena. Italy, Brazil, the Czech Republic just passed pretty much like a Second Amendment. Like, people are starting to wake up, and they realize, the game that's been played over the last 30 years or so.
Yeah. I definitely think that a lot of people are waking up, but unfortunately there's still a lot of normies out there, and they're like these really irritating posts I've been seeing on Facebook, as if the FDA is actually important, and people, just so many of my like dumb progressive kids I had the misfortune of having to go to college with. These people are like whining about getting rid of the FDA, which is literally just like a giant pay-to-play organization so that like large pharmaceutical companies can push their stupid fucking pills on unsuspecting masses and get rid of like other potential treatments like a kratom or even psychedelics or whatever, which would be so much more, they would be so much more helpful in solving a lot of these problems, but they want to like keep on like recharging people every month for like the same like shitty like dulling effect. But that's basically how the FDA operates. It's like a pay to play for those people to like push their like crappy treatments on you, and then bar all competition.
Right, and it's really funny too. A lot of the FDA's approvals, it's based off of quote unquote scientific studies. But if you look at some of the writers of these studies, a lot of them have no medical degree. Instead, they're simply marketing, these products that are pushed onto the American people every day. Especially something like an SSRI. It takes years to get off of one of those. Especially if you've been on it for even just a few months. It completely affects your neurochemistry in a very dangerous way without actually, if you're taking it for something like depression, for example, you're not getting to the root of your issues. It's simply a numbing agent. It's simply going to allow you to continue, without really thinking about your core issues and what's causing these problems in your life. And that's sort of a tangent, but, yeah, it's the same sort of, people have been swindled, and people the amount of people that are waking up to see this truth, especially, in light of the first wave of COVID lockdowns, and as we start to consider the second wave of COVID lockdowns, you're going to continue to see more and more people, more and more frustration, and a higher chance for Trump and or other populist movements in the future to take root again. And so, yeah, I think between Biden's complete alienation of most people and the right's momentum, I think you're going to see a lot of surprises this election, particularly with Joe Jorgensen. I think that Trump has been such a great figure for the right that people who are libertarians who are previously afraid to like vote libertarian because, you know, for lack of or for the chance that they're being ridiculed or like social pressures, I think they're going to say, screw it. If you can riot, then I can vote third party. I can vote with my conscience. And so they have really kicked the hornet's nest in this with this election.
Yeah, the only thing that I'm interested in is that you know, if I think that initially the idea for essentially like Joe Jorgensen or whatever was probably like designed to sort of like split the vote or something, but I think that that's not even really working, or like is kind of like backfiring because, you know, because it was designed to like split the right wing vote, because I feel like, you know, you just get like a moderately more like Facebook ads about it. There seems to be like at least some sort of funding apparatus that's like funding her campaign into existence. So I think the only reason why she was probably getting that money is because they're like, oh well, let's split the rights vote and get Biden in. But the issue is that she almost like turned the tables on them and started like mainly advertising to left-wing individuals, which I find really funny. I mean, you know, technically that's a conspiracy theory, but I don't know.
Well, it wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility with the Clinton campaign. You saw the Pied Piper strategy.
That's true.
Give all the airtime to Donald Trump, make the right look insane, and here we are 4 years later talking about a likely second Trump victory, which it was it's almost difficult to watch, like watching a train wreck in slow motion. These people are doing the same thing to their own party.
Yeah, they didn't learn anything.
A single thing. And the elitism too, it really showed, because a lot of, you know, there was just perception, especially on like Facebook, that there's just been rednecks that have been in the streets against the lockdown measures, and more we're seeing these are average rational people who've simply lost their businesses, and and that's that smug elitism that's going to, you know, really kill the left, because the left has just been so comfortable. They've controlled the culture, they've controlled the politics. Nothing's really ever threatened them until now, and we have a world that's starting to push towards decentralization. It's starting to, you know, long for the days of true national sovereignty, and it's going to be at the expense of a lot of these liberal pipe dreams that we've
had the misfortune of being the guinea pigs for.
Right. And people are generally sick of, you know, feeling like guinea pigs, feeling like they're knobs on a lever, you know. These crazy left-wing social engineers, they've lost control of this thing. They, at least I think.
Yeah, I mean, I'm certain that they still have some like tricks up their sleeve, but I think that they definitely don't have like full control over Trump. At least he at least disobeys them at times.
Right.
So I think that's probably why they don't like him that much.
And even if it's 5% of the time, it's pretty spectacular to watch some of the reactions. I'm in a rare position. You know, I'm a libertarian concerned about climate change. I think we can have market-based solutions, but it is kind of funny to see people's reactions to, you know, for example, when the California wildfires were occurring and everyone was like, this is the smoking gun, this is climate change. Like, partially that's true, that's a contributing factor, but another factor that people overlooked was putting out every fire over the last 30 years, no, like 50 years or so, putting out every single fire. And typically what would happen in these forests is you'd have these much, you know, less intensely hot fires that would take out smaller sections of the forest, would clear the underbrush. And it's just really funny because these liberals have lived in comfort in California without fires going on. They've completely disrupted the natural cycle over there, and now they're seeing the consequences of that. The underbrush has grown to much greater levels, and I don't want to keep going too far on this topic, but it's just a really funny metaphor for the lack of control that these people have at this point. They're losing ground, just as they are with the fires. I guess it's sort of an extended metaphor there. I hope someone at least sort of gets that.
I think another good metaphor for them losing is, well, I mean, it's barely a metaphor. It's actually just it's really barely a metaphor, but everyone bailing out of California and New York is also, I think, a pretty good indicator of the fact that people are really tired of those policies. But I am worried because a lot of the times these people in the big city have so little self-awareness that they ride into a new place that's unaffected by their control schemes, and then they try to vote in the exact same policies that just destroyed the place they came from. So I really hope at least some of these people are learning their lesson and not just kind of being man, why are my taxes so high, leaving and then voting for higher taxes.
Right.
That would they do that a lot though.
Yeah, I mean, let's see, I'm just going down our list here. I think we've covered pretty much every major point that we were looking at.
Yeah, I think that I don't know. So I think the official prediction is I do see a Trump win. And I think that if you see I think here's how Biden can still win. It's like that meme, here's how Bernie can still win. But here's how Biden can still win. Election rigging.
Oh my gosh, this you just completely reminded me of what's going on with the ballots.
Yeah.
And when Trump had mentioned, let's see if there's going to be a peaceful transition of power, a lot of people are it's because he's rallying the militias and there's going to be this civil war and he's pushing on. No. What he meant was, with this mail-in voting, there's going to be a level of fraud. There's going to be a level of deception, and they're going to try to drag this thing out as long as they can to keep the crisis going.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess.
Well, I do want to kind of talk a bit more about that. So, specifically, like I mentioned in Boston, they found burned ballots, an entire box of votes. In portions of Pennsylvania too, dumpsters full of ballots. And so, I guess really, what we want to come away with is likely a Trump victory, but that also means likely a massive amount of civil and social unrest, especially over the next few months. That combined with the tensions from the pandemic, it's going to be a rough time for pretty much everyone. So I guess recommendations to our viewers is learn how to can food, learn how to grow your own food. Take time if you haven't already, purchase a firearm, learn how to defend yourself, because this is going to be a very bumpy ride no matter who wins, really.
Yeah. Maybe also buy some gold coins.
Gold coins, yeah.
Just in case, right?
Is there anything else we're missing here? I'm trying to think.
I think that about covers it. Remember, kids. I guess get out there and vote. Nah, just kidding. It's not that important.
It's really not going to make a difference. Statistically, you're very unlikely to affect change. Sorry to say it, sweetie.
Alright, here's looking at you, kid.
Go get 'em.